History is supposed to keep its promises. Names should lead to places, places to stones, stones to dates. But with Perseus, the trail feels tampered with, as if some careful hand has rubbed a thumb across the ink. Why does a hero so famous arrive to us with so many seams showing, so many bright patches stitched over older fabric? Why does the story glow most where it should be plain, and fall silent precisely where a witness ought to speak? So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And if you feel like it, tell me your location and your local time right now, as if we're leaving a small lantern lit in different corners of the world. In the oldest rooms of memory, there is always a missing shelf, a space where tablets should have stood, a gap where a genealogy should have been anchored. Perseus stands in front of such a gap, and the myth smiles as if nothing is wrong. He's introduced as a clean, shining answer to a question we never heard. The slayer of Medusa, the rescuer of Andromeda, the founder, the ancestor, the one whose line runs forward into the more historical age, where cities claim him like a seal pressed into wax. Yet if someone listens closely, there is a softer sound under the trumpet of heroism, a hush that does not belong to celebration. It belongs to removal. It is tempting to treat Greek myth as a cabinet of dreamlike tales, immune to the rules of evidence. But myths were never weightless. They travelled through mouths that needed to eat, through courts that needed legitimacy, through sanctuaries that needed offerings. The story of Perseus, told and retold, was a kind of currency. And currency, when it matters, gets counterfeited, recalled, reissued, stamped with new faces. The myth may be true in the way a shoreline is true, constantly rearranged by tides, faithful only to the pressure that moves it. So what pressure moved this one? The beginning is already cramped with fear. Acrisius, king of Argos, consults an oracle and receives a sentence that is almost administrative in its cruelty. He will be killed by his daughter's son. The prophecy is tidy, like a line item on a ledger. It turns human life into a foreseeable liability. And it exposes something uncomfortable about the ancient world that still persists. When power hears the future, it does not kneel in awe. It tries to manage it. Acrisius responds the way an anxious ruler might, by rearranging the bodies around him. He locks away Danaë, his daughter, in a sealed chamber, bronze or stone depending on the teller, but always shut, always controlled. Even before Zeus arrives in his famous disguise, the mood of the myth is already one of incarceration, surveillance, and the panicked belief that walls can outvote fate. There is a reason sealed girl stories appear across cultures like recurring bruises. Sometimes they are cautionary tales about desire. Sometimes they are political parables about dynasties. Sometimes they preserve the memory of real practices, seclusion of high-status women, protective confinement, or even ritual isolation in certain cult contexts. The problem is not that the motif exists. The problem is how smoothly it excuses what comes next. Zeus enters as a golden rain, a phrase so beautiful it can make the listener forget to ask crude questions. What is golden rain, if not the language of bribery softened into weather? A god does not need to persuade metal to pass through cracks, but men do, guards do, courtiers do, priests do. The myth offers a miracle that covers logistics like snow covers footprints. And then, after the miracle, a child appears, as if the sealed room was always meant to be opened from the inside. Perseus is born into a contradiction, a prophecy that created him as a threat, and a divine paternity that frames him as unpunishable. If Acrisius kills the child, he risks offending the god. If he spares the child, he risks fulfilling the oracle. This is where the story becomes interesting, because it reveals the precise shape of cowardice. Acrisius does not spill blood with his own hand. Instead, he turns to the oldest weapon of clean rulers, distance. Danaë and the infant Perseus are placed in a chest and cast into the sea. That image, a mother and child sealed in wood, is so stark it feels older than the rest of the tale, like a fossil embedded in later ornament. Exposure myths exist everywhere. Babies left on mountains, set adrift on rivers, hidden in baskets. Scholars compare them, trace their migrations, weigh whether they arise independently from shared human anxieties or spread along trade routes like contagious songs. The Mediterranean, with its constant movement of sailors, captives, and pilgrims, is a particularly fertile place for such motifs. Yet the Perseus chest has an additional taste, not merely abandonment but disposal, as if the sea were a mouth that could swallow evidence. And seas do swallow evidence. They also return it sometimes broken and barnacled onto new shores. When the chest washes up on Seriphos, it is found by Dictys, a fisherman. Even the name Dictys smells of nets, as if the myth is trying to tell us that whatever is thrown away will be caught again, sooner or later. Danaë survives. Perseus survives. The king of the island, Polydectes, enters later, and with him the story shifts into another register. Coercion disguised as hospitality, desire disguised as governance. But before the plot hurries toward Medusa and the glittering apparatus of divine weapons, there is a quieter question, the kind that keeps a person awake after the music ends. Why does Perseus need to begin with a sealed room and a sealed chest? If the story were only about heroism, it could start with a young man eager for glory. But this one begins with containment, then exile, then political pressure. It begins like a case file that has been partially burned, and perhaps that is the point. Perhaps Perseus, so often presented as the clean champion of order, is actually born from the anxiety of order that cannot trust itself. Because prophecies in myth often behave like leaks in a ship. Once the water is noticed, the crew scrambles, not to understand the sea, but to patch the plank, to silence the alarm, to pretend the vessel is still sovereign. Yet the sea does not care about sovereignty. It does not bargain. It only moves. There is a darker possibility, one the myth never says aloud, but keeps suggesting through its choice of images. What if the prophecy is not mystical at all, but political intelligence dressed in sacred language? You will be killed by your daughter's son could mean, the next generation will overthrow you, and it will come through the line you tried to control. In dynastic courts, threats are often domestic. They come from within the family, from marriages, from heirs, from the quiet arithmetic of succession. Oracles in that reading become a sanctioned way to speak dangerous truths without naming the human informants who already know them. And if that is true, then Danaë's imprisonment is not a fairy tale cruelty. It is a tactic. It is a protocol. It is the erasure of one branch of a family tree to protect another. The golden rain becomes a story that launders scandal. The chest becomes an elegant way to remove a mother and child without the public stain of execution. But the sea, again, is not an incinerator. It is an archive with strange filing methods. The Greeks themselves lived with the awareness that their world had breaks in it. They told of floods, of ages that ended, of cities swallowed by earth or sea. They watched coastlines shift. They watched islands tremble. They rebuilt after earthquakes. Modern geology confirms what their bones already knew. The Aegean is restless. Volcanic events like the eruption of Thera, centuries before classical Athens, rearranged horizons and may have contributed to cultural disruptions that echoed for generations. People inherit not only land but trauma, and they sometimes compress it into story because plain speech is too sharp to hold. So when a myth insists on a child cast into the sea, it may be doing more than dramatizing royal fear. It may be touching an older memory of drifting survivors, of flotsam and silence, of lives unmoored by catastrophe. It may also be doing the opposite, hiding a deliberate human act behind the fog of fate, as if the universe, not a king, chose to gamble with a woman's body. And Perseus, growing up on Seriphos, would carry that fog inside him. Not a simple origin, but an origin that feels like an attempted deletion. A hero raised in the aftertaste of a near erasure might become obsessed with proof of his own solidity. He might seek monsters because monsters are easier than bureaucrats. He might prefer the clean morality of a beheading to the dirty ambiguity of court, rooms and sealed chambers. Yet even now, before Medusa's name is spoken, the story has already offered its first missing fragment. What did Danaë say in that chest, in the long hours when wood creaked and salt sprayed and the child cried? Did she curse the king? Did she bargain with the god? Did she promise her son that the world would make sense again? The myth does not record her words. It rarely does. It keeps the hero's lineage but loses the mother's voice, as if the price of a famous ancestor is the quiet removal of the person who carried him through the dark. And perhaps that is the first true mystery of Perseus. Not the monsters he will face, but the silences that built him. If a story begins by throwing evidence into the sea, what else might it be training the listener not to ask for? Something stays unsettled in the way the story speaks of the locked room. If the oracle's sentence truly belonged to a god, why does Acrisius react like a man filing paperwork in a panic, managing risk, controlling variables, trying to make a future behave like a budget? And if Danaë is sealed away to stop what is coming, why does what comes arrive in the exact shape of intrusion, as if the king built his own trap and then flinched when it sprang? They cannot even agree on the architecture. A chamber of bronze, a tower, an underground vault. The details wobble, as if the tradition keeps changing the lock because it cannot bear to look at the key. Bronze sounds strong, permanent, authoritative. It is the metal of gates, of storehouses, of civic pride, of things that are meant to endure longer than skin. But bronze is also a conductor. It does not swallow sound, it returns it. A bronze room is a prison and an instrument at once, and there is a particular cruelty in that kind of enclosure. Not only isolation, but amplification. Every breath comes back to you as an echo. Every quiet thought taps the metal wall and returns like an accusation that will not stop accusing. In dynastic history, the hiding of royal women is not rare. It is called protection, or honour, or security. Soft words for hard hands. Some societies treat the bodies of heirs like national borders, guarded, regulated, patrolled. If Danaë is locked away, it may not only be fear of prophecy. It may be fear of timing, fear of alliances, fear of an unauthorized marriage, or an inconvenient pregnancy that could rearrange power. Fear of another name entering the genealogy like a stain that cannot be scrubbed out. Fear, finally, of losing control over the narrative of origin. Because a ruler does not only rule land, he rules the story of why he deserves it. Then the myth offers its velvet cover. Zeus arrives as golden rain. The phrase is so beautiful, it tries to make the listener stop asking ugly questions, but beauty can be an anesthetic. Golden rain is too convenient, too smooth, too eager to turn logistics into weather. If the room was truly sealed, who opened it? Who looked away? Who carried the message down the corridor? Whose hand held the bribe? whose voice delivered the instruction. A god does not need accomplices. A palace does. The myth lifts the event into the sky so the listener will look up, not sideways. Looking up, there is only radiance. Looking sideways, there might be a door, a guard, a transaction. And this is not a childish cynicism. It is the way institutions survive. When an incident is too dangerous to tell plainly, it becomes symbol. When an accusation would fracture a court, the court teaches itself to speak in metaphors. When a violation is too shameful to admit, it is laundered through divinity. The actor becomes a god. The victim becomes chosen. The coercion becomes fate. No one must be tried. No one must be punished. The story can keep walking through generations without smashing the dinner table of the powerful. Danaë's body, however, remains stubbornly real inside the dream. A girl locked away because of a prophecy, and then she is pregnant. In a society obsessed with bloodlines, pregnancy is evidence that refuses to be erased. The belly becomes a document the palace cannot shred. Yet the myth does something revealing. It gives the kings fear, but it withholds Danaë's voice. We are told he panics, but we're not told what she says in the moment she is discovered. We do not hear her explanation, her protest, her dread, her rage. We do not hear whether she names anyone. The silence is not accidental. It feels engineered, as if the tradition knows that if Danaë speaks clearly, the entire tale tilts, and the hero's clean lineage grows smudged. Across cultures there are repeating bruises of narrative. The girl in the tower, the girl in the sealed room, the guarded virgin, the mother who becomes a mother through an impossibility. People explain these motifs as symbols of purity, of transformation, of the threshold between maiden and mother. Sometimes they are that. But repetition can also mean something uglier, a persistent social technology, the control of reproduction as a form of governance. And whenever governance controls reproduction, it tends to wrap its hands in sacred language. Replace the king ordered it with the god desired it, and violence acquires a robe. The robe allows the community to keep the story without bleeding from it. There is also a darker irony that the myth never states, but keeps circling. A king may need a god not to explain his daughter's pregnancy, but to protect his own reputation. If a mortal man entered Danaë's prison, then the palace security failed. The court becomes laughable. The king becomes weak. Factions smell rot. A rival might use the scandal like a knife. But if Zeus did it, then the king did not fail. The king was simply outmatched by inevitability. Not incompetence, but destiny. Not a breach, but a miracle. What looks like reverence can be a political disinfectant, and so Perseus is born with a strange passport in his blood. He is Danaë's child, therefore the threat the oracle announced, but he is also Zeus's, therefore dangerous to touch. The boy becomes a living knot in the state's rope, forcing the court to choose how to deal with him, kill him openly and risk sacrilege, or keep him and risk the prophecy, or remove him without spilling blood where witnesses can count the drops. The myth says Acrisius chooses the cleanest option in public. He does not murder the child with his own hands. He sets mother and infant into a chest and gives them to the sea. But clean is a costume. A chest is not mercy. It is a way to make violence look like distance. It is a way to erase a person while pretending the universe did it. It is also a way to erase records. You do not have to deny someone existed if you can make them. Disappear into salt and weather, into a place where evidence dissolves. Still, there is a stubborn detail in the myth's own imagery that should make a careful listener uneasy. If the room is made of bronze, if it is meant to keep the world out, then Danaë's impregnation is not merely miraculous. It is a confession that no enclosure is truly secure. A locked room is supposed to mean control, yet the story insists that control fails. And once control fails in the most protected space, the mind begins to wonder what else fails, quietly, everywhere. If the king cannot secure one chamber, can he secure a city? If the palace cannot guard one girl, can it guard its history? Because history too can be locked away. Not in bronze, but in archives, in family trees, in official versions. And those versions always have seams, where the thread pulls tight over what cannot be admitted. Perseus's origin feels like one of those seams. The myth speaks with confidence, but it changes its details like a witness who cannot keep a story straight. Bronze or stone, tower or vault, golden rain, not human hands. Silence in Danaë's mouth, loud fear in Acrisius's heart. And the more the tale insists on the divine, the more one suspects the divine is being used as a screen. If a screen is being used here, who benefits? Danaë, who loses her voice. Perseus, who gains a pedigree. Acrisius, who avoids direct blood guilt. Or the city-states that later want Perseus as an ancestor, a legitimizing stamp pressed onto their own claims. Myth is not just entertainment. It is inheritance lore spoken as poetry. And there is one more question that clings like damp cloth, refusing to dry. If golden rain is a phrase that softens what happened in the sealed room, then how many other shining elements in Perseus's story are similarly softened, similarly polished until they look like miracles? How many later scenes with divine gifts and clean heroics are the same old machinery wearing holy paint? If the first mystery is hidden behind metal walls, perhaps the first monster is not waiting in the wilderness at all. Perhaps it is waiting in language itself, in the way language can turn an act into an omen, a perpetrator into a god, a victim into a footnote. And if the tradition could make Danaë silent inside her own story, what else could it make silent later, once Perseus begins to move through the world like a blade? What witness disappears next, not into a chest, but into the phrasing of a legend? The sea chest should feel like a simple device, a quick bridge between a frightened king and the island that will raise the child. Yet the more quietly one sits with it, the less it behaves like a bridge, and the more it resembles a missing page. Why does the tradition choose a chest at all, sealed and wood-bound, instead of the more direct cruelty of a blade, or the more politically tidy solution of a hidden adoption? Why does it insist on the sea, that enormous moving archive where causes blur and responsibility can be rinsed clean? Acrisius does not kill Perseus. That is the surface mercy. But there is a colder mercy that rulers sometimes prefer, because it leaves no blood for the ground to remember. A chest can be called a vessel. A vessel can be called a chance. A chance can be called fate. And in that chain of softening words, a human decision slips into the wardrobe and comes out dressed as weather. It is tempting to imagine Danaë inside that box as myth imagined her, noble, composed, an icon of endurance. But the chest is a real object in the mind, heavy with practical questions. Wood swells when it drinks salt, nails loosen, ropes bite into wrists if someone bound them, air grows thin, a baby's cry becomes a danger because it cannot be soothed by a room, only by a body, and the body is trapped with it. How long does a mother last in darkness before the darkness begins to feel like a second skin? And what prayers are spoken when the only ceiling is a lid that will not answer? The Greeks loved the sea, feared it, depended on it. They knew its moods were not moral. They knew it gave fish without gratitude and storms without warning. In later centuries, sailors would carve names on stone and pray to keep their ships from becoming driftwood. But long before those prayers were recorded, people already carried in their bones the knowledge that the sea does not merely separate lands, it can also erase them. Coastlines move, harbours silt up, islands are born and islands crack. In the Aegean, earthquakes can rearrange a map the way a hand rearranges a tabletop. So a story that throws a woman and child into that water may be doing more than dramatising a king's fear. It may be brushing against older memories, older anxieties, older losses that never found their own clean narrative. Across the Mediterranean and beyond, there are other children in containers, other infants in baskets, other mothers clinging to a floating boundary between life and the indifferent world. Some of these tales are sacred, some political, some literary, some whispered into lullabies. Their similarity can be explained in the polite way. Motifs travel, stories echo, cultures borrow. But sometimes the repetition feels less like borrowing, and more like bruising, as if many societies were struck by the same kind of event, and each one tried to compress it into an image that could be carried. A baby exposed to water is not only an abandonment, it can be a residue of disaster, the way a community remembers a flood without admitting that it happened, or without being able to date it, or without being able to name the dead. When people survive sudden ruin, they often preserve the shape of it in symbols: a chest, a wave, a mother, an infant, a shoreline that is both rescue and accusation. Even in historical times, ships have vanished so completely that only splinters return, and rumours do the rest. The sea is an editor that never signs its work. And yet, there is another possibility that does not require catastrophe, only politics. In dynastic courts, disappearance is often preferable to execution because disappearance allows denial. If Danaë and Perseus die, Acrisius can tell himself, and tell his city, that he did not murder them. He only sent them away. The sea chose the ending. The sea wrote the report. The sea, that perfect scapegoat, accepts blame without protest. This is a technology older than law, letting nature do what hands are ashamed to do in public. The chest also performs a subtler function. It preserves the possibility of survival, which is essential for myth. A dead infant is a closed story. A floating infant is a question. And questions are where listeners lean in. They lean in because the mind cannot tolerate a narrative that looks like it is about to vanish. The tradition may be manipulating that instinct, using the cliff edge of uncertainty to keep the listener obedient, awake, wanting resolution. But what if the manipulation is not only aesthetic? What if it is ideological? What if the story trains a community to accept that some lives can be removed from the record and still be spoken of as if nothing immoral occurred? The island of Seriphos appears like an afterthought in many retellings, but islands are never afterthoughts in real history. Islands are laboratories of power. They are small enough to be monitored and isolated, and porous enough to be shaped by passing ships. They are places where grain shipments can become leverage, where hospitality can become surveillance, where a king's smile can carry the weight of a port tax. If Danaë and Perseus wash up there, the story is not merely changing scenery. It is relocating them to a political environment where control can be exercised quietly, and the person who finds the chest is not a prince, not a priest, not a hero, but Dictys, a fisherman. His name tastes like nets, like woven cords drawn tight, like something designed to catch what tries to slip away. It is almost too perfect, and perfection in myth can feel like a warning. When details align too neatly, one begins to wonder whether they are preserving truth or manufacturing meaning. Still, a fisherman as rescuer carries a strange kindness. It suggests that the lowest hands in a society sometimes become the hands that interrupt a ruler's plan. But what does it mean to rescue someone the sea was meant to silence? Does rescue restore the victim, or does it simply relocate the victim into another system of dependence. Danaë survives, yes, and Perseus grows, yes. Yet survival is not the same as freedom. Sometimes survival is only the beginning of another subtler captivity, living by permission, eating by tolerance, existing under the gaze of those who can revoke safety when it becomes inconvenient. Even the chest itself begins to look less like a container and more like a symbol of what history does to women's testimonies. The mother's experience becomes a sealed object carried forward by currents of retelling. People talk about the chest, talk about the miracle, talk about the hero who emerged from it, but the interior of it remains unknowable. That is how archives work when they have been curated by power. The file exists, but the pages inside are missing. The label is intact. The contents have been removed. And perhaps this is why the sea chest episode feels older than the glittering adventures that follow. It contains a primitive terror that a person can be placed inside a narrative box, shut and pushed away, while the world continues to call itself civilized. That terror does not belong only to myth. It belongs to every era that has used exile as sanitation, every era that has called disappearance policy, every era that has trusted distance more than justice. When the chest finally scrapes onto land, it does not end the rupture. It only changes its texture. The story wants the listener to feel relief, to inhale and believe the worst is over because the baby lives. But a careful mind notices something quieter, something that lingers like damp wood. The chest did not merely transport Perseus, it initiated him into a world where identity is contested, where survival is accidental, where the powerful can attempt to erase you without ever naming you as their victim. And if that is the true beginning, then the later monsters are not interruptions, they are continuations. A hero who starts as discarded evidence may spend his entire life chasing the feeling that his existence cannot be thrown away again. So the sea gives him back, but the sea also teaches him its lesson, that anything can be taken and anything can be returned, and neither act requires an explanation. The question that remains, like a salt taste that does not fade, is whether Perseus is being delivered by fate, or being repositioned by forces that understand how to erase a life without killing it. And if a chest can carry a mother and child across the water, what else can a sealed container carry across time, unnoticed until it opens in the wrong hands? If the sea returned them, it did not return them to innocence. That is the contradiction that begins to breathe once Seriphos comes into view. An island sounds like safety, a small ring of land where a mother and child can be hidden from a king's reach. But islands are also places where power can become concentrated, where exit is a rumour, where the horizon is a fence made of water. And if a story has already shown a locked room and a locked chest, why would it suddenly offer an unlocked life? Dictys pulls the chest from the tide like a fishman pulling up a secret. The tradition gives him the gentle role, the rescuing hands, the simple decency. Yet even this kindness has a shadow. A fisherman can save you, yes, but he cannot give you citizenship. He cannot give you a new name that is safe from questions. He cannot erase the fact that you arrived without witnesses, without papers, without the protection of a household strong enough to intimidate the curious. In many societies, especially those built on lineage and belonging, being saved is not the same as being secure. It is only being placed quietly inside a different network of dependence. So Danaë and Perseus live, but they live under someone else's tolerance. And tolerance is a kind of weather. It can change without warning. The king of Seriphos, Polydectes, enters the story like a polite hand that does not let go. In some tellings he appears as a host, in others as a man with a hunger he cannot disguise for long. But even when the myth paints him as openly predatory, it keeps the mechanism subtle. There is no sudden violence in the beginning. There is pressure, there are invitations, there is the slow tightening of social obligation, which is often more effective than a sword because it recruits the victim's own conscience as the jailer. The Greeks had words for the sacredness of hospitality, the ritual exchange between guest and host, the idea that a stranger under your roof is protected by custom and the gods. But customs can be inverted. A sacred rule can become a trap precisely because decent people still obey it. Offer a meal, offer protection, offer a place to sleep, and then remind the recipient that they owe you. Not money, not openly, something softer, something that can be called gratitude, something that can be called duty, something that can be called what a woman must do to repay the shelter that kept her child alive. Is it any wonder that islands throughout history so often cultivate this kind of power? They depend on supplies. They measure time by shipments. They learn to treat scarcity as leverage. An island king does not need vast armies. He needs control over docks, granaries, and reputation. He needs people to believe there is nowhere else to go, and no one else to appeal to. When the sea is your wall, law can become a private language. Danaë, in this atmosphere, becomes both honoured and hunted. She is royal by origin, which gives her a glow the island court can use, but she is also displaced, which makes her vulnerable to being rewritten. And Perseus grows in the middle of it, old enough to feel the strange imbalance, young enough to interpret it as personal rather than structural. The myth does not have to say he felt watched. The situation says it for him. A boy whose existence embarrasses a king in Argos and complicates a king on Seriphos would learn early that adults smile differently when they are calculating, and then the story performs one of its most familiar moves, a move that appears in many legends and many real political histories, the impossible quest. Polydectes announces he will marry and demands gifts. The surface reads almost festive, a social ritual, a show of wealth. But gift exchange has always had a darker twin. Gifts can be receipts. They can be proof of subordination. They can be a way to measure who can be pressured and who cannot. In the language of power, a demanded gift is not a gift at all. It is a compliance test. Perseus, perhaps proud, perhaps rash, perhaps tired of the air around his mother, promises something extravagant, the head of Medusa. And it sounds like youthful boasting, the kind of line a young man throws into the world without understanding how quickly the world will grab it and use it. But boasting is not always spontaneous. Sometimes it is coaxed. Sometimes an older man knows exactly how to provoke a younger one into offering a fatal promise. If Perseus had stayed silent, would Polydectes have invented another pretext? Probably. The trap does not depend on one phrase. It depends on a structure. The powerful man's desire, the young man's pride, the mother's vulnerability, the island's isolation, the social theatre that turns coercion into etiquette. This is where the myth begins to feel less like a fairy tale and more like a case study in how violence hides in civility. No one drags Danaë through the street. No one declares her property. Instead, there is a banquet, a demand, a promise, a public expectation. The machinery of honour is used to do what brute force would make too obvious. The king does not need to harm Perseus directly. He only needs to send him far enough away that he does not return. And if Perseus dies on the road, then again, responsibility dissolves into distance. The sea did it. The wilderness did it. The monster did it. The king simply organised the conditions. There is another layer here that the story keeps half covered, as if ashamed of its own clarity. Perseus's quest is not only about Medusa, It is about removing a protector. It is about emptying the space around a woman until she is easier to claim. Throughout history, when a man wants access to someone, he often first targets the brother, the son, the husband, the father, the friend. Not always with murder, sometimes with promotion, sometimes with deployment, sometimes with an opportunity that sounds honourable. The result is the same. The guardian is gone, and the vulnerable person is left inside a smaller circle. So when the myth tells of Polydectes and his demand, it is telling something ancient and ordinary in the tone of something fantastical. It is letting the listener watch coercion without calling it by its name. And perhaps that is one of the deeper seductions of myth. It can show a society its own face and still make it feel like entertainment. But why then does the story need Perseus to accept? Why not have him refuse, stay close, protect Danaë with blunt defiance? Because refusal would expose the problem too nakedly. It would force the tale to become about political resistance on a small island. It would require witnesses, arguments, allies, consequences. A monster quest is simpler. A monster quest turns social rot into a distant target. It relocates the conflict away from the court and into the wilderness, where the hero can be pure, where killing can be clean, where the audience can cheer without having to consider the uncomfortable possibility that the real predator sits on a throne. And yet, even as the myth moves Perseus toward the Gorgons, it leaves behind a quiet ache. Danaë remains on the island with a man who has already shown his intentions. We are not told the daily texture of her fear. We are not told whether she's guarded, whether she's threatened, whether she's made into a symbol in someone else's hall. The myth, again, loses the mother's interior life. It keeps her as a motive, not as a mind. And that absence is not neutral. It feels like one more missing document in the archive. Sometimes the most unsettling part of these old stories is not the supernatural, but the way the supernatural distracts from what is painfully plausible. A king who uses social custom to isolate a young man. A court that laughs while a mother's safety depends on a son's obedience. An island that can pretend its cruelty is simply the way things are, because the sea has removed alternative options. Perseus leaves, and the tale treats it like destiny. But destiny often looks exactly like a carefully arranged corridor of choices, each one shaped by someone else's hand. If a hero is pushed toward a monster so that a king can reach a woman, then who is the monster in the first place? And if the entire quest begins as a manipulation, how many of the divine interventions that follow are answers to prayer, and how many are just later layers of paint applied to a political wound? An impossible quest is rarely impossible in the way it pretends to be. It is impossible only for the person being sent. For the one who sends him, it is merely remote. That is the quiet contradiction Perseus carries as he leaves Seriphos, because the path ahead is described like a blank space on a map, and yet the story somehow knows where to point him. If no one can find the Gorgons and return, then who exactly provided the directions in the first place? And if the directions exist, why are they guarded so carefully that they must be stolen rather than taught? The myth begins to speak of old women at the edge of the world, the Graeae, and it is tempting to take them as decoration, as a strange flourish meant to entertain. 3 sisters, grey from birth, sharing a single eye and a single tooth. But myths often hide their most practical anxieties inside their strangest images. A shared eye is not just grotesque, it is administrative. It suggests a world where sight is rationed, where information is not a common sky, but a tool passed hand to hand, lent out, retrieved, denied. It suggests an institution so old it has become bone, so habitual it no longer needs to explain itself. The Graeae do not merely see, they possess access, they sit at a threshold, and Perseus does not persuade them with charm or devotion. He uses force, trickery, theft. He takes the eye while it is mid-transfer, while it is neither fully owned nor fully protected. That detail has the flavour of something observed about real systems. Power is most vulnerable not when it is strong, but when it is moving. A secret is safest when it is locked away, but it must sometimes travel, carried by a messenger, spoken in a corridor, written on a tablet that must be transported. The moment of exchange is the moment of risk. The myth makes that risk literal, turning it into a small, tense gesture, the eye passing from one hand to another and a young man interrupting the ritual. What kind of eye was worth guarding like this? In later eras, sailors and merchants treated routes like treasure. Knowledge of currents, winds, harbours, reefs, friendly coastlines, hostile coastlines. The Mediterranean looks small on modern screens, but for a wooden ship and a human stomach it was a labyrinth, full of hunger and sudden weather, and men who waited with knives. A map was not a neutral object. It was advantage. It was survival. Even today one can read ancient writers who describe distant lands with a mixture of certainty and distortion, as if they are repeating reports that have been filtered through fear, pride, and deliberate vagueness. Some scholars have long noted that geographic knowledge in antiquity was unevenly distributed, concentrated in trading networks, priestly centres and courts, passed along selectively rather than freely. It is not hard to imagine a world in which the eye belongs to the few and the many move half blind. So the Graeae become less like witches and more like gatekeepers of navigation, of thresholds, of sanctioned pathways. The story does not call them priests, but it gives them a priestly function, and their age matters. They're old enough to imply continuity. They're old enough to feel pre-political, like something that existed before the current kings, before the current laws, before the current versions of the story. Old women in myth often carry the weight of what came earlier, what the bright new regime cannot fully erase. And perhaps that is why they are made grotesque. Grotesque figures can be laughed at, feared, dismissed. A gatekeeper turned into a monster becomes easier to rob. Perseus, then, is not just seeking Medusa. He is seeking the coordinates of forbidden knowledge, and the method is troubling. The hero does not ask politely and receive guidance as a reward for virtue. He extorts it. He withholds the eye until the old ones speak. If this is a moral tale, it is a strange morality. Unless, of course, it is not a moral tale at all, but a confession. A confession that the path to power often runs through coercion. A confession that knowledge, in a world ruled by scarcity, is not given, it is taken. But why would the location of the Gorgons be treated like a state secret? The myth says they live at the edge of the world, somewhere beyond ordinary travel. Yet the Greeks, like many peoples, frequently placed the most dangerous things at the margins, as if distance itself were a kind of quarantine. When something is too frightening or too socially disruptive to keep near, the imagination pushes it outward. The monsters move to the horizon, and the horizon becomes a moral boundary. But boundaries can also be political. If Medusa's head is a weapon, then access to her is access to the weapon. The story may be admitting, in its own sideways way, that there are technologies of fear that must be controlled. Not everyone is allowed to obtain them. Not everyone is allowed to look. The single eye also suggests another unsettling possibility, that seeing is collective, not individual. A centralized gaze passed between hands, owned by a small circle, used to decide what is permitted to be known. And if a centralized gaze exists, then it can be used not only to guide heroes, but to rewrite stories. It can decide which witnesses are remembered and which are treated as noise. It can decide that Danaë's words are unnecessary. It can decide that a king's shame should be rebranded as divine light. It can decide that a coercive island court should become merely a stepping stone to adventure. One eye can do that, especially if it is the only eye the culture agrees to trust. And what does Perseus do with that eye in the moment he holds it? He becomes briefly the one who controls the gaze. For a heartbeat of mythic time, the young exile from Seriphos holds the lever of information. He forces the keepers to speak. He turns the system against itself. It sounds triumphant until one remembers that the system remains. The old women are not destroyed. The eye is returned. The gatekeeper survives the robbery. The structure continues. Perseus is permitted to pass, perhaps because the story requires it, perhaps because institutions sometimes allow a single breach if it serves a larger outcome. Because there is always the possibility whispered under the myth that Perseus is not purely escaping manipulation. He may also be entering a deeper corridor of it. Polydectes pushed him outward, yes, but now other hands seem to be guiding him, hands older than island kings. The Graeae belong to an older layer of the tale, and their presence suggests that the hero's journey is being processed through an ancient bureaucracy of secrets. He is not simply walking into wilderness, he is being routed. The myth never pauses to explain why a hero should be comfortable with taking an eye from the elderly. It does not linger on their helplessness. It does not ask whether they are victims of their own strange economy. It moves on quickly, as if embarrassed by what it has admitted. Because the scene raises a question that can make even a devoted listener uneasy. If the hero's first major act of seeking truth requires theft and blackmail, then what does that say about the truth he will eventually carry home? And yet the story insists this is necessary. Necessary like a lie told to survive. Necessary like a name changed to avoid being hunted. Necessary like a child placed in a chest because a king did not want blood on his hands. Perseus comes from those necessities. He is built from them. So perhaps it is fitting, in a bleak way, that his path forward is also paved with them. Still, something lingers in the image of that single eye, passed between three sisters in the dim borderland of the world. It feels like a warning disguised as a fable, a warning that vision can be monopolized, a warning that guidance can be controlled by those who claim to be merely old, merely inevitable, merely part of the landscape. And if Perseus can steal the eye for a moment, then someone else can steal it too, later, perhaps without returning it, perhaps without anyone noticing until the whole world begins to move as if in twilight. Because a culture that shares one eye is a culture that can be blinded in a single gesture. And when it is blinded, who gets to decide what remains visible? Who gets to decide which monsters are real and which are just masks for human hands? The directions the Graeae surrender do not feel like a gift. They feel like a wound opening. Because once a path exists, it can be followed again. Once a secret is spoken, it can be overheard, copied, misfiled, sold. And if the location of the Gorgons is knowable at all, then the story's most comforting lie, that the monsters live safely at the edge of the world, begins to thin. Perhaps the edge is not a place. Perhaps it is simply where the record goes soft, where witnesses stop, where the ink runs out, where anything can be placed because no one can check. And so Perseus moves toward Medusa, but not in a straight line. The myth itself hesitates around her, as if the name has weight. Not just a monster, not just a target, but something that causes the storytellers to change their grip. The tradition cannot keep her stable. Sometimes she is born monstrous, one of 3 Gorgon sisters, already a violation of nature. Sometimes, in later tellings, she is not born a horror at all, but made into one. A beautiful priestess violated in Athena's temple, punished not by the perpetrator, but by the goddess whose sanctuary was defiled. It is hard not to notice what kind of societies prefer which version. A culture that needs clean heroes may like the monster who was always a monster. A culture that has begun to taste its own guilt may invent a backstory that sounds like a tragedy, not a pest control job. But even tragedy can be a disguise. It can create sympathy while still keeping the punishment intact, still keeping the severed head as a trophy. Medusa is, in this way, less a character than a contested file. A dossier that's been edited across centuries, with additions and deletions, with margins scraped and rewritten. Her oldest face may be the most startling, not because it is cruel, but because it is too familiar. Archaeologists keep finding her gaze on temples, on shields, on mosaics, on cups, on coins. The Gorgonean, the mask with the staring eyes, the protruding tongue, the wild hair. It is placed where one would not expect a defeated enemy to be placed. It is placed like a guardian. It is an apotropaic device, meant to avert evil, to repel the envious eye, to keep danger from crossing a threshold. Which raises an uncomfortable question that the myth rarely asks aloud. Why would a community put the face of a monster on its most sacred architecture if the monster is only a monster? Sometimes what is feared is also what is used. Sometimes the most terrifying image becomes a tool precisely because it terrifies. A face that turns you to stone is a perfect symbol for defense. You do not need to defeat an attacker, you only need to stop him, arrest him, freeze him, make him an object that can be stored, displayed, forgotten. In that sense, Medusa's power is not merely magical. It is bureaucratic. It transforms a living problem into a static artifact. Turning to stone is a strange punishment. It is not death, not in the ordinary way. It is stillness. It is a human becoming a monument without consent, and perhaps that is why the image keeps resurfacing in the human mind. Because people have always lived among stone that looks like bodies. In caves and cliffs there are shapes that resemble figures. In landscapes carved by wind there are pillars that seem like crowds. Even in the ancient world, travellers describe places where rock formations felt like petrified life, as if the earth had witnessed something and refused to forget it. Modern geology explains how such forms arise, how mineral-rich water can petrify wood, how sediments can preserve outlines, how sudden volcanic ash can hold a shape long enough to become a cast. Yet explanation does not remove the shiver. The shiver remains, because the mind is not satisfied by mechanism when it senses metaphor. If a myth says a gaze can petrify, it may be carrying a memory of natural catastrophe in the clothing of a moral lesson. There are scholars who have suggested that certain monster motifs preserve impressions of older events. Eruptions, ashfalls, sudden suffocation, floods that set bodies in place and then harden the scene into legend. One does not need to insist this is literally what happened to see how easily the human imagination would stitch such an experience into a story about a face that stops time. When people cannot record a disaster in an archive, they sometimes record it in a monster. And the monster becomes portable, the monster becomes teachable, the monster can be invoked at bedtime without naming the dead. But there is another possibility, colder and closer. Turning to stone may also be a social description, what it feels like to witness a taboo, or to be caught in a gaze that strips you of motion, choice, speech. Fear can petrify, shame can petrify, authority can petrify. There are people who freeze when threatened, and their bodies become their own prisons. If Medusa is a symbol, she may be symbolizing not an external magic, but an internal collapse, the way a nervous system becomes rock under the wrong kind of attention. And if so, then her gaze is not a fantasy. It is an observation that has been poeticized. What, then, is Perseus actually being sent to retrieve? A head? A weapon? Proof? The Island King wants him gone, yes, but the myth's deeper machinery seems to want something else. A portable terror, a tool that can end arguments without needing an army. A head that, once acquired, shifts power instantly. Because whoever holds it can settle conflicts in a single gesture, leaving behind not a battlefield but a sculpture garden of the defeated. It is too efficient. It almost sounds like the dream of authoritarianism, the perfect method of governance. No messy trials, no public dissent, just silence, preserved. And yet, strangely, the story wraps this acquisition in ritual caution. Perseus cannot look directly. He must use a reflection. He must approach sideways, mediated, as if acknowledging that unfiltered truth is lethal. A mirrored shield is a clever detail, but it also feels like a confession about the nature of knowledge. Some things cannot be faced head-on, not because they are supernatural, but because they are politically unbearable. A society may only be able to approach its own horrors through reflections, art, myth, symbol, legend. Direct testimony would destroy too many reputations. It would fracture too many gods. In some versions, the Gorgons sleep when Perseus arrives. Sleep again, that recurring softness over violence. A sleeping monster is a convenient target. It prevents the listener from having to imagine a conversation. It prevents the possibility that Medusa could speak. Because if she spoke, she might describe her origin. She might name who harmed her. She might ask why the hero's mission is her death rather than her justice. The myth avoids this by making her either wordless by nature or unconscious at the crucial moment. A clean beheading. A swift act. The hero does not have to listen. And this is where the story begins to resemble the earlier silences. Danaë's voice withheld. Now Medusa's voice withheld. Women as thresholds. Women as problems to be contained, women as containers of power that must be extracted. If one sits with that pattern long enough, it starts to feel less like coincidence and more like an editorial policy, a selective archive, a tradition that prefers women as motives rather than narrators. And every time the tradition does this, it leaves the same kind of gap, an event with no testimony, a crime with no courtroom, a transformation with no recorded interior life. Even Athena's role is hard to hold without discomfort. Goddess of wisdom, of strategy, of the city. Yet in the later tragic frame, she punishes Medusa. Is that wisdom, or is it institutional self-protection? When a sanctuary is violated, institutions often respond by blaming what is easiest to control. The perpetrator may be too powerful, too protected, too central to challenge. So the punishment falls on the one who remains within reach. The mythic version of this is divine. The historical version is depressingly familiar. And so Medusa becomes a site of argument, a figure that changes shape depending on who is speaking and what they need. Monster, victim, talisman, warning, tool. The only stable thing is the gaze, the idea that looking has consequences. But what kind of looking? The look of desire? The look of envy? The look of authority? The look of a storyteller choosing which parts to show and which to seal behind bronze? Perseus, approaching the Gorgon, is therefore approaching more than a creature. He's approaching a contradiction the culture cannot settle. If he kills a monster, he is a hero. If he kills a wronged woman, he is something else, and the tale must work harder to keep him shining. That may be why the myth floods the scene with magical equipment and divine endorsement, as if the presence of gods can sanitize the act. Yet divine endorsement has always been one of the easiest ways to launder a human choice. When the blade falls, the story says something else rises. From the severed neck-spring Pegasus and Chrysaor, strange births from a strange wound. Even here, life emerges from violence, as if the myth cannot help admitting that killing does not end a story. It releases other stories that were trapped inside it. A winged horse, a warrior, symbols that will migrate into other legends, other lineages, other claims. The head becomes portable power, but the blood becomes messy legacy. And still, a question hangs in the air like the afterimage of a bright object seen in the dark. If Medusa's face was used to protect temples, and if her gaze was feared as a weapon, and if her origin shifts depending on who benefits from her silence, then what was she before the myth pinned her down? A demon at the edge of the map, or a mask for something closer, something human, something the city needed to externalize? And if Perseus is carrying her head back toward people, back toward politics, back toward the places where stories get edited, what will happen when that gaze is aimed not at monsters but at witnesses? After the blade falls, the air is supposed to clear. A monster is supposed to simplify the world. Yet the myth does not let simplicity happen. It immediately crowds the scene with objects, with equipment, with gifts that arrive as if they'd been waiting in some invisible storeroom all along, and that is the next contradiction to watch closely. If Perseus is a lone hero, why does he need so much apparatus? If his triumph is meant to be moral, why does it depend so heavily on tools, on technique, on a kind of sanctioned engineering that the story calls divine so no one has to ask who made it, who kept it, who decided who was allowed to touch it? The shield that becomes a mirror is the most famous, not a shield that stops a spear, but a surface that edits reality, turning direct sight into a safer, slanted knowledge. It is easy to admire the cleverness, to let the mind rest in the comfort of a solution. But a reflective surface is never neutral. It changes what it shows. It reverses. It flattens depth into image. It allows someone to look without being seen looking, which is another kind of power. In sanctuaries and burial sites across the Greek world, archaeologists have found polished bronze objects, mirrors among them, sometimes offered to goddesses, sometimes placed with the dead, sometimes carrying the quiet implication that reflection had a sacred charge, not merely a cosmetic one. A mirror can be a sign of vanity, yes, but it can also be a controlled portal, a way of approaching what is dangerous through a surface that belongs to you. So when Perseus uses reflection to kill, the myth is not only telling a trick, it is describing a philosophy. Do not face the terrible thing directly. Approach it through mediation, through art, through ritual, through a sanctioned instrument. That may be wisdom, or it may be training. A culture can survive by teaching itself never to look straight at its own violence, always at an angle, always through polished bronze, always with a story between the eye and the wound. Then there is the blade, often described as a sickle-like sword. The harp, a shape that feels older than hoplite warfare, older than clean iron points and disciplined ranks. Curved blades appear across the ancient Near East and Eastern Mediterranean, in images and in metal tied to harvesting and sacrifice as much as to battle. The curves suggest cutting not only flesh but attachment, severing what is bound. A straight sword pierces, a sickle takes, it gathers by cutting. It is difficult not to feel the agricultural shadow behind this weapon, the sense that beheading a monster is being narrated with the grammar of harvesting. And harvesting is never gentle. It is life taken so that life can continue. If this weapon is given by a god, then the act becomes clean in the story's eyes. If the weapon is inherited from older traditions, older technologies, older rites, then the act becomes something else, a ritual the culture keeps repeating, with different masks, each time insisting it is new, each time pretending the older blood is not still wet on the handle. And then the strangest gift of all, the cap of invisibility, often linked to Hades, the underworld, the realm that swallows names. Invisibility is a dream that returns in every era because it is a dream of consequence-free action. To move unseen is to move unaccountable. To be unseen is to be exempt from witness. But myth rarely admits that this is also the wish of tyrants, spies, thieves, and institutions that prefer to operate without records. The cap makes Perseus safe from the Gorgons, yes. It also makes him safe from judgment. When no one can see you, no one can testify. The sandals, too, the winged shoes, promise speed, escape. The ability to cross distances that would otherwise grind a person down. But notice how the story keeps pushing Perseus away from ordinary human limits. He is not merely brave, he is augmented, he is upgraded. And in a world where most people walk, where travel is hunger and weather and broken ankles, the ability to fly is not just convenience, it is class, it is separation. It is the kind of advantage that turns a mortal into something that looks like destiny. So the myth builds a hero out of equipment, and then calls the equipment divine, so the listener will not ask where power actually comes from. Because power in real history comes from workshops, from mines, from trade routes, from controlled knowledge, from the hands that know how to make bronze shine like a second sun. When a city can outfit a man, it can also direct him. It can also rewrite what he did with what it gave him. Even the bag, the kibisis, the special container for Medusa's head, has the feeling of ritual bureaucracy. Not just a sack, but a designated object, the proper protocol for transporting forbidden force. The head cannot be carried openly, it must be contained, managed, stored. In that, the myth starts to resemble the handling of dangerous sacred objects in sanctuaries, the way some things are veiled, boxed, shown only at certain times, to certain eyes, with certain words spoken. The head is a weapon, yes, but it is also a relic. It belongs to that uneasy category of things a community both fears and needs, like fire, like plague, like truth. And if the head must be carried in a sanctioned container, then perhaps the story is admitting something it never says plainly. Perhaps the Gorgon's gaze is not simply a monster's power. Perhaps it is a kind of force that humans learn to use and then learn to regulate with ritual, because it was too socially disruptive to leave ungoverned. A terror that must be portable, but not freely accessible. A technology that must be hidden in plain sight, kept as a privilege. The gods who supply Perseus are often framed as benevolent, but benevolence is not the only reason an institution arms a young man. Sometimes it is recruitment, sometimes it is patronage, sometimes it is a way of binding a person to a cause by making him dependent on what only the patron can provide. A hero who owes his victory to gifts can be praised, yes, but he can also be claimed. His story becomes a billboard for the giver, and Athena, goddess of the city and of strategy, has every reason to prefer a hero whose success demonstrates the value of controlled technique over wild strength. Hermes, the messenger, the patron of crossings and cleverness, has every reason to favour a hero who wins through theft, stealth, and speed. These are not random divine moods. They are the mythic faces of social functions that never stopped operating. So Perseus returns from the edge not only with a head, but with a kit, a complete set of sanctioned methods. He has learned how to approach horror indirectly. He has learned how to move without being seen. He has learned how to take what is guarded. He has learned how to carry a forbidden object without looking at it, which is another kind of training. to wield power without fully confronting what it is made of, and the myth, quietly, keeps repeating its earlier pattern. A sealed room, a sealed chest, now a sealed bag. Containment after containment. The story behaves as if the most important acts cannot happen in open air. They must happen behind metal, behind wood, behind leather, behind the lid that closes while someone decides what version of events will be told. There is a bleak tenderness in this, if one listens the way one listens to waves at night. Perseus may be doing what he must to survive, but survival, shaped by secrecy, tends to reproduce secrecy. A child thrown away becomes an adult who carries dangerous proof inside a bag, careful never to let it touch the wrong eyes. A boy used by a king becomes a man who can end arguments without conversation. And if that is what the gods truly provide, then the gifts are not only gifts, they are a curriculum. So he turns homeward, flying over distances ordinary people must crawl across, invisible when he chooses, carrying the head like a sealed verdict. And somewhere under the story's polished bronze, another question begins to move, slow and persistent, like something alive beneath ice. If a hero is assembled out of tools that erase witnesses, avoid direct sight, and deliver instant silence, then what exactly has been created here? A saviour, or a perfectly portable mechanism for ending dissent? The return should be the part where the story exhales. The monster is dead, the weapon is secured, the hero is on his way back to the island that tried to discard him. Yet the myth refuses to grant that simple release, because a head like Medusa's does not belong to the category of trophies that can be celebrated in sunlight. It belongs to the category of proof that must be handled in a whisper. And once Perseus carries such proof, the question shifts, quietly but completely, from whether he can survive the wilderness to whether anyone around him is allowed to survive what he now knows. He moves through the air like a rumour that cannot be stopped. Sometimes the tradition makes him visible, sometimes it makes him vanish, as if even the storyteller cannot decide whether witnesses should be permitted. The cap that erases him from sight is a strange companion for a hero, because heroes are usually made of spectacle. They are supposed to be seen. They are supposed to be counted, praised, recorded. Invisibility is the opposite of legacy. It is the technique of those who do not want their names attached to outcomes. And yet Perseus uses it, not only to escape danger, but to pass over the world without being challenged by it, without being delayed by anyone else's questions. This is where the myth begins to feel like it is teaching something, not announcing it. The hero learns that it is easier to move through history if history cannot look back at you. Some versions of the tale let him cross paths with other figures along the way, small scenes like stones dropped into a dark pool, ripples that fade quickly but leave a sour taste. A titan, Atlas, is sometimes said to be turned to stone when Perseus shows the head. A name like Atlas, heavy with the sense of carrying the sky, later becomes a word for maps, for the arrangement of the world into pages. If that detail is not an accident, then it is a remarkable confession. The one who holds up the structure of the world, the one who might be imagined as an old framework of knowledge, becomes a mountain under the hero's gaze. A living bearer of the heavens becomes landscape. A witness becomes geology. And it happens instantly, cleanly, with no need for persuasion, no need for trial, no need for rebuttal. Is this justice? Or is it silencing made beautiful? Because turning someone into stone is not only killing, it is transforming a voice into an object. It is taking movement and turning it into permanence. It is a way of making the victim useful even after they have been removed. A mountain becomes a landmark, a warning, a story support. The myth may be admitting that power does not only want enemies dead, power wants enemies repurposed. When Perseus finally returns to Seriphos, the island has not been waiting in stillness. Polydectes has not been softened by time. He is still a king, which is to say he is still surrounded by people who benefit from not contradicting him. Danaë, in many tellings, has fled to the temple with Dictys, a sacred refuge that sounds comforting until one remembers why such refuges exist at all. Temples are not built for ordinary peace, they are built because ordinary spaces are not safe. A sanctuary is a social wound dressed in marble. So the hero comes home not to celebration, but to a scene already arranged. A court, a man who claims authority, a woman who has had to hide inside holiness to avoid being handled as property. If this were a modern story, people might call it evidence, they might call it motive, they might call it a case. But myth does not like cases. Myth likes gestures. Perseus walks into Polydectes' hall and reveals Medusa's head. The king and his men turn to stone. This is the moment that is often told with triumph, with the satisfaction of a threat neatly erased. Yet if one lingers in it, the satisfaction begins to rot at the edges. A hall filled with statues is a hall filled with bodies that cannot explain themselves. The king is gone, and with him the entire chain of commands that could be traced, questioned, exposed. There is no interrogation, no testimony, no public accounting of what Polydectes intended, what he threatened, what he did while Perseus was away. The head ends the story the way censorship ends stories, suddenly, irreversibly, with a heavy quiet. And maybe that is the real seduction of Medusa's power. Not that it kills, but that it ends discourse. It is worth noticing who does not get to speak in this ending. Polydectes does not get to defend himself, which is easy to accept because he's a villain. But Danaë does not get to speak either. She does not stand in court and say what was done to her, what was promised, what was implied in the smiles and invitations. Dictys does not become a witness who explains the island's economy of intimidation. The servants do not confess what they saw. The island does not have to look at itself. It is as if the story is allergic to any resolution that involves a community naming its own sickness. Instead, it allows a supernatural mechanism to remove the sick part and leave the rest untouched. That is comforting. It is also suspicious. Because a king does not rule alone. A king is a knot of relationships. When the king becomes stone, what happens to the people who enabled him? They remain flesh. They remain plausible. They can shrug and say they knew nothing, that they were only obeying, that they were as surprised as anyone. The head solves the immediate problem, but it also erases the trail. It does what the chest in the sea was meant to do, remove the evidence while preserving the surface of respectability. Perhaps that is why the myth likes the image so much. It allows the listener to feel the sweetness of vengeance without having to swallow the bitterness of social complexity. The villain is frozen. The hero is clean. The mother is safe. The story can move on, but even here, the myth cannot keep the power entirely in Perseus's hands. He does not keep the head forever. Eventually he gives it to Athena, who places it on her aegis. The gesture looks pious, as if the hero returns a dangerous thing to divine custody. Yet it also looks like policy. A weapon that can silence a room cannot be left in private hands, not even heroic ones. It must be institutionalized. It must be placed on the armor of the goddess who represents strategy, the city, the sanctioned order of war. So Medusa's face, once a living horror, becomes an emblem. It becomes a badge. It becomes official. And what does it mean when the ultimate instrument of petrifying fear is absorbed into the iconography of civic protection? It means the city does not simply defeat monsters, It adopts them. It means the state does not merely destroy terror. It displays terror in a controlled frame and calls it safety. It means the line between protection and intimidation is thin enough to be worn. Perseus, in this moment, is praised as liberator, but he is also revealed as courier. He carried an extraordinary force from the margins to the centre. He delivered it from the wild edge of the map into the hands of the order that will preserve, regulate, and deploy it. And perhaps that was always the purpose of his journey, whether he understood it or not. One can almost hear the older machinery behind it. A young man, exiled and pressured, is sent to retrieve a weapon. The weapon returns and instantly resolves a domestic political conflict. The weapon is then transferred to higher authority for safekeeping. The agent is rewarded with honour, and the institution grows stronger. It is a pattern that repeats in many eras wearing different costumes. Yet something is still wrong. It is wrong in the way the story moves too fast past the stone-filled hall, too fast past the consequences of introducing such a force into human affairs. Because if a head can end arguments without witnesses, then it can also end justice without witnesses. It can silence the guilty, yes, but it can also silence the inconvenient. It can protect a mother, yes, but it can also protect a narrative. And this is where the quiet dread begins to settle in. Perseus has solved the island's immediate danger, but he has also learned the shape of an absolute solution. He has learned how easy it is to remove a person from the world without spilling blood, without leaving a mess, without leaving a voice behind. He has been taught, by gods and by circumstance, that the cleanest endings are the ones that cannot be questioned. So when he turns his face toward Argos again, toward the old prophecy, toward the king who tried to erase him in a chest, the listener may feel the familiar anticipation. A reckoning is coming, a confrontation, a return of the discarded. But another thought slips in beside it, colder and harder to name. If Perseus has been trained to end problems by petrifying them, what will happen when the problem is not a predator on an island, but a grandfather, a bloodline, a prophecy, a civic reputation? And if history can be rewritten by turning a room full of men into mute statues, how many other rooms, in other eras, have been solved the same way, leaving behind only monuments and the official story that explains why the silence was necessary? Argos is supposed to be the destination, the place where the prophecy finally finds its address. Yet the closer Perseus comes to the old homeland, the more the myth begins to drift, as if the land itself is trying to step sideways out of its own record. Why does the story hesitate here when it should be most concrete? Why does it choose detours, coastlines, strange local crises, as though the straight road back to Acrisius is lined with eyes that must not see him too soon? A hero returning home should be a public event, but Perseus has become fluent in arriving without witnesses. Somewhere along that return the tale turns toward another shore, and introduces a woman chained to rock, and a crowd watching as if watching is the only civic ritual they have left. Andromeda. The name is famous now, almost too bright, almost too polished. But the scene itself has the texture of older fears, the sea as judge, the community as accomplice, the victim as payment. If the story began with Danaë sealed away and set adrift, why does it now offer another woman bound at the edge of water, waiting for something immense to rise and erase her? Are these two scenes meant to rhyme, or is the myth confessing that it can only imagine female bodies at the boundary where power negotiates with catastrophe? The official explanation is tidy. Andromeda is punished for her mother's vanity, for boasting that she surpasses sea nymphs, for offending an old, wet divinity that cannot tolerate comparison. An oracle demands sacrifice, the monster is sent, the girl is chained, and the city calls this justice. Yet justice here behaves strangely. It does not examine the one who bragged. It does not restrain the proud tongue. It does not demand restitution or reform. It demands a body. And the body demanded is not the offender's but her daughter's, the easiest currency to spend because it does not belong to the ones making the decision. When a society chooses sacrifice, it often chooses the person with the least leverage. The myth presents this as cosmic law, but it also resembles the logic of frightened administrations. Find a scapegoat, make it public, hope the sea calms down. And what is the monster in the most plausible light? The story calls it a sea beast, sometimes Cetus, a name that later will be used for whales and deep creatures that humans map mostly through rumour. The ancients watched the sea with the same suspicion modern people reserve for dark space. They knew shapes moved beneath the surface that could not be negotiated with. They knew storms could push bodies onto the shore that looked as if something enormous had handled them. They knew that earthquakes could lift or drop a coastline in a night, turning familiar harbours into traps. To a community living near the water, monster might simply mean the portion of nature that refuses to sign treaties. Yet the myth chooses a very specific public theatre, the girl chained in plain sight, the crowd waiting, the king and queen bound to the oracle's terms, the coastline turned into a stage. That detail feels less like pure fantasy and more like cultural memory. Many ancient societies left traces, in texts and in archaeology, of offerings to sea powers, of rituals meant to appease Poseidon or local gods of harbours and storms. The Greeks themselves told of cities struck for impiety, of rulers punished through waves, and in the wider Mediterranean sacrifices, whether human in literal practice or human in the symbolic imagination, appear again and again as a way to translate helplessness into procedure. When the sea frightens you, you invent a reason it is angry. When you invent a reason, you can invent a payment. Payment gives the illusion of control. Perseus arrives into this scene carrying the most absolute payment of all, a weapon that ends disputes without debate. But he does not use Medusa's head here, at least not always in the older versions. Instead, he fights the monster with blade and boldness, as if the myth briefly wants to remember what it is like to solve a problem without turning the world into statues. Or perhaps it wants the rescue to look like virtue rather than censorship, a clean romance rather than the cold efficiency of petrification. Because Andromeda is not only a life to be saved, she's also a marriage to be made, an alliance to be claimed, a story that can be displayed as proof that Perseus is not merely dangerous, he is desirable. That is the soft undercurrent beneath the heroism. Rescue myths often behave like treaties. A stranger proves strength, a local ruler grants a bride, and the new bond rewires legitimacy. It is a way of converting violence into kinship. The audience is invited to feel relief, to watch the chain break and believe this is simply love arriving on time. Yet the civic machinery remains visible if one stares at it long enough. A girl is offered because a city needs to survive. A hero is rewarded because a city needs a protector. The marriage closes the wound in public, the way a well-placed ceremony can close an argument without answering it. And then comes the complication the myth refuses to let die. Andromeda is not unclaimed. Another man stands nearby, in some tellings her betrothed, in others a relative who believes he has rights like property rights, and the rescue becomes not only a battle with the sea, but a battle with human entitlement. The wedding feast turns into blood. In that transformation, the myth shows its true face for a moment. Monsters are rarely the only problem. Even when the sea is calmed, the social order does not automatically become gentle. A hero can save a woman from a beast, and still have to save her from the men who wanted her as a prize all along. What does Perseus do then? He uses Medusa's head. He ends the conflict without the mess of extended civil dispute. He freezes opponents into stone, and the feast becomes a gallery of silence claims. It is effective. It is final. It is the kind of resolution rulers dream about when factions multiply. But is it a victory, or a warning about what power prefers when it is tired of arguments? The myth keeps insisting he is righteous, yet it keeps showing him choosing the cleanest kind of erasure. And still, Andromeda herself remains strangely quiet. She is rescued, she is married, she is moved like a precious object from chain to household, from one set of watchers to another. The tradition does not linger in her mind. It does not ask what it does to a person to be displayed as communal bait, to be framed as a solution to weather. It does not ask what it means to live afterward with the knowledge that a crowd once watched you wait to die. If Danaë's voice was sealed behind bronze, Andromeda's is sealed behind ceremony. Different materials, same containment. Perseus continues, now carrying a wife and a reputation that can open gates. But the prophecy is still ahead like a shadow that never quite aligns with the body casting it. The myth pretends that detours are incidental, that rescuing Andromeda is simply another glittering episode. Yet detours can also be delays engineered by fear. If Perseus returns to Argos too directly, too soon, the confrontation becomes obvious, perhaps too obvious. Perhaps the tradition prefers the prophecy to fulfill itself indirectly, without anyone having to admit that anyone aimed for it. Perhaps that is why the tale keeps placing Perseus at the edge of disasters and disputes, training him again and again to solve crises with sudden irreversible force, until the final accident can be framed as mere fate. So the coastline fades behind him, and the story moves on, but it leaves a damp question clinging to the listener like salt on skin. If the sea monster was a wave dressed in teeth, and if the sacrifice was a city's attempt to bargain with geology, then what else in Perseus's life is a negotiation with forces that do not speak? And if the myth keeps translating those negotiations into girls on rocks and heroes with weapons, is it because that is how the ancients understood the world, or because that is how power taught them to? If history is rewritten by turning conflicts into statues, then how many chained figures have vanished from the record, leaving behind only the heroic pose of the one who saved them?